And joining in the conversation tonight on the new travel restrictions, Ibis Valdes and Tony Figueroa, both from the Miami Young Republicans, but both with very different takes on these new restrictions. We thank you both so much for joining us. Ibis, I want to start with you. Where do you fall on the new restrictions and why specifically?
So I fall where the majority of Cuban Americans lie, in that we've tried one way, the embargo, for over 50 years, and it simply has not achieved its end goal of depriving the Cuban regime and its military and all its other branches of oppression from actively oppressing its citizens and its residents. So this is simply, I think, we are in a time where Cuba is, you know, not where it needs to be, but there certainly are reforms that are promising that didn't even exist 10 years ago in regards to internet connectivity, property rights, entrepreneurship, where I believe we can perhaps leverage our interest and our influence in a different way that is much more impactful and sustainable than the embargo.
Tony, you and Ibis not at all on the same page here. Why shouldn't the U.S. dollars be flowing into Cuba?
So one of the reasons why tourists shouldn't be going to Cuba is because a lot of that money that goes to the Cuban military, GAESA, which is under the armed forces of Cuba, they essentially control tourism in the country. Those dollars flow into the Cuban military. It's used to prop up and foment disorder in neighboring countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua. It's been reported there's about 20,000 Cuban advisors in Venezuela. We see what's going on in that country, and all of that stems from the Cuban military, which essentially runs the country. I mean, you look at cruise ships going to the ports. Those ports were stolen during the Cuban Revolution. By tourists going to those ports, they're essentially legitimizing that robbery that was carried out by the Castros and the communists. So leaving tourist dollars there, it's just too many negative things. I mean, it props up sex tourism, also is another problem. A lot of women, out of economic necessity, they go into the trade, and they're taken advantage of by foreign men as well. Young men also, they try to take advantage of women who go to the country. It's kind of their ticket out of the island. So it's nothing positive for the Cuban people. It's only positive for the thugs that run that country, and it's the Cuban military.
There are many issues that are wrapped up in here and in your answer, but do you think that this move is less about the regime itself and more about the regime supporting other regimes like Venezuela's Maduro here? Because that's something that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin actually alluded to today as well. Ibis?
So this is really about the most marginalized population that will feel the impact of this drawback, and it's definitely the Cuban people. If we're talking about, you know, isolating other states that support the Venezuelan regime, then why don't we also enact travel bans to Turkey, to Russia, and so many other countries that are on that list? But when it comes to Cuba specifically, it just seems like this is really more for a short-term political gain at the cost of the long-term impact on the Cuban people and their small but bustling private sector.
Tony, do you think that these actions, these restrictions, will sway the Cuban regime at all? Will they have the desired impact?
I think it'll put pressure on them, and in the long run, right now that's what Trump's looking at. He's playing the long game. It's to put pressure on them, as Stephen Mnuchin had said. Right now, they're destabilizing essentially countries that neighbor the U.S., so it's a national security threat to us, where they're in the Western Hemisphere with us, and there's destabilizing countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, countries that are only hours away from us. So, you know, when you talk about Russia and Turkey, those are different political circumstances. Cuba, you know, they've kind of been a thorn in the U.S.'s side. They've been involved in really exporting their own brand of communism and causing trouble in the Western Hemisphere. So I think Trump's playing the long game, and I think he should keep up the pressure, really.
Ibis, I want to ask you this question, because the Cuban Minister of Foreign Affairs called these new restrictions, quote, an attack on international law. He says that it's the main obstacle to our development and a flagrant violation of the human rights of all Cubans. So how is this a human rights violation?
So you're talking to the right person. I happen to have a master's in international human rights law. I do not recall ever coming across a measure like this being considered a violation. This is the U.S. You know, the U.S. is a sovereign nation, and it's allowed, you know, the federal government is allowed to enact whatever measures representatives deem necessary to achieve a desired effect. But that being said, you know, there certainly is something to be said about again, like, this is not really playing for the long game, because if we're talking about drawing back from the steps that we've made to try and, revitalize the Cuban private sector as much as we can as Americans, I'm just wondering what kind of plan does the Trump administration have right now to construct an escape valve for Cubans that might be impacted severely by this measure? Because as far as I'm concerned, we are living in a time with the most restrictive immigration laws. Even for Cubans, it has been notoriously difficult to get paroled, to get asylum status, to get refugee status. So I feel like we're just kind of at an impasse where we want to achieve this effect through this measure we've been trying for over 50 years, but then also cornering innocent Cubans into a corner, essentially punishing them for the sins of the regime.
A very interesting conversation tonight. Ibis Valdes and Tony Figueroa.